One country controls 60% of the world's most critical EV metal, and America is almost completely locked out. That country is Indonesia, and right now it is tightening its grip on nickel in ways that are sending shockwaves through American supply chains, defense procurement, and the entire green energy agenda. What happens when the US bets on a green energy future but doesn't control the minerals to build it? That is exactly the question this story answers, and the answer is not comfortable. Nickel is not a niche industrial commodity, it is a critical mineral that sits at the foundation of modern civilization as we know it today. Nickel-rich cathodes give electric vehicle batteries their extended range. Stainless steel, which accounts for approximately 70% of global nickel demand, depends on it for everything from hospital equipment to kitchen infrastructure to bridges. Defense-related alloys used in military hardware and naval vessels require nickel. In 2024, the world consumed 3.4 million tons of nickel. The International Energy Agency projects that figure will rise to between 4.5 and 5.4 million tons by 2040. Clean energy technologies already account for nearly 20% of nickel demand in 2024, and that share is projected to reach 40 to 50% by 2040. The world's largest nickel reserves are concentrated on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, which alone accounts for more than half of global nickel mine production. Indonesia's share of global nickel supply jumped from 31.5% in 2020 to 60% in 2024. The IEA projects Indonesia will supply 67% of the world's mined nickel by 2030 and 75% by 2040. No other country comes close. To understand how Indonesia got here, you have to go back to 2020 when former President Joko Widodo banned raw nickel ore exports. The stated goal was to force value-added processing to happen inside Indonesia rather than abroad, capturing more economic value domestically. Before that ban, Indonesia already supplied roughly half of China's nickel ore imports, creating a level of dependency that made withdrawal extremely costly for Chinese firms. The ban triggered a massive surge of Chinese-backed investment into Indonesian smelters and processing facilities. China's Going Goto strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative provided state-backed financing at below-market rates, financing that was simply unavailable to Western companies operating under normal commercial conditions. Tsingshan Holding Group, a Chinese metals and mining company specializing in stainless steel and nickel, became the anchor investor in Indonesia's new industrial era. In 2013, at the launch of the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, Tsingshan signed a Memorandum of Understanding, witnessed by Xi Jinping and then Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, to develop what became the Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park (IMIP). By 2015 to 2017, the IMIP was operational, functioning not merely as a smelter complex but as a sprawling industrial city equipped with ports, coal-fired power plants, and dedicated logistics systems. The IMIP is now the largest nickel industrial hub in the world, hosting at least 15 operational smelters with a combined capacity of 500,000 to 700,000 tons of nickel per year. Chinese firms now control roughly 75% of Indonesia's nickel refining capacity, with Tsingshan and Jiangsu Delong alone accounting for over 70%. Then came the technological breakthrough that sealed Western exclusion. Western companies had long tried and failed to process Indonesia's low-grade laterite nickel deposits into battery-grade material. Projects in Australia and Papua New Guinea were plagued by cost overruns and engineering failures. Chinese firms Tsingshan, JIM, Kaetil, and Huayu Cobalt cracked the code with high-pressure acid leaching (HPAL) technology in 2021. HPAL converts low-grade ore into mixed hydroxide precipitate (MHP), a key precursor material necessary for EV batteries. Over 80% of Indonesia's battery-grade MHP output now comes from Chinese-affiliated projects. Indonesia went from 3 smelters in 2014 to 49 RKEF smelters plus 5 HPAL facilities by 2024. Nickel export revenues grew from 11.9 billion in 2020 to more than 38 billion by 2024. Imports of nickel matte to China rose nearly 28-fold between 2020 and 2023, with over 90% of it from Indonesia. While China was building this dominance, the United States was retreating. North and South America's combined share of global nickel output fell from 16% to 7% between 2020 and 2023. Europe's share dropped from 35% to 10% in the same period. Indonesia's surge in supply pushed global prices downward, forcing higher-cost competitors in Australia and New Caledonia to put their facilities in care and maintenance, further consolidating the market around Indonesian production. American companies did not just fail to enter, they actively exited. Freeport-McMoRan, which had operated the Grasberg copper gold mine since the 1970s, was forced to divest a majority stake in 2018 after years of domestic pressure, and committed to build a domestic copper smelter as a condition for retaining its mining rights. Newmont Mining exited Indonesia entirely in 2016 after prolonged disputes over export restrictions, divestment mandates, and processing requirements. Mandatory divestment laws and overall uncertainty in the operating environment make it extremely challenging for Western mining companies to enter the country at scale. The structural reason is straightforward. Western companies depend on stable regulations and predictable returns. China's hybrid ecosystem of state-owned and private enterprises can absorb volatility, accept low margins, and operate in environments that deter most foreign investors, deploying capital rapidly with below-market financing. Indonesia's resource nationalism policies have the effect of entrenching China's presence while limiting the United States' role in a key Indo-Pacific country. The most revealing data point about America's position came in 2023 when Ford, America's most iconic automaker, announced a $4.5 billion partnership with Vale Indonesia and China's Huayu Cobalt to build an HPAL facility in Indonesia. Even Ford, despite geopolitical tensions, had to partner with a Chinese firm to make the project viable. That is the uncomfortable reality. You cannot access Indonesian nickel without going through China. Political roadblocks compounded the problem further. The lack of a free trade agreement with Indonesia prevented Indonesian nickel from qualifying for the clean vehicle tax credit under the Biden administration, while pressure from senators and NGOs blocked a US-Indonesia critical minerals agreement. The only operational nickel mine in the United States exports ore to Canada for processing. Then came the plot twist. In 2025, Indonesia launched a sweeping crackdown on what it called illegal exploitation of natural resources, claiming many mining and plantation licenses were tainted by bribery or never properly approved. Authorities seized more than 4 million hectares of mines, palm oil plantations, and processing sites, levied $1.7 billion in fines, and signaled that another 4.5 million hectares could be seized in 2026. In one of the most dramatic moments, Indonesian soldiers, accompanied by a local television crew, took control of part of the world's largest nickel mine, mostly owned by Chinese metals giant Tsingshan Holding Group. That mine had been linked to deforestation, air and water pollution, increased coal-fired emissions, community displacement, and health risks, according to a 2024 report by Climate Rights International. Analysts are clear that this crackdown is not primarily about environmental protection. Bima Yudhistira of the Jakarta-based Center of Economic and Law Studies, CELIOS, stated directly, "There is no guarantee things will get better, they could get even worse." The real motivation appears to be reasserting state control over a sector dominated by foreign, primarily Chinese capital. Indonesia wants to diversify its customer base. China built the industry, but it is no longer the largest growth market for nickel. The crackdown, however, has created serious investor uncertainty. Yudhistira warned, "This is making the future of nickel, both mining and downstream processing, unknown." Uncertainty is very costly for investors. In April 2025, LG Energy Solution withdrew from an $8.4 billion battery investment in Indonesia, citing market and investment conditions. The deeper problem for Indonesia is that the market itself has shifted. Indonesia's entire strategy was built on the assumption that nickel-rich batteries would dominate the EV market. That assumption is now being challenged by the rapid rise of lithium iron phosphate (LFP) batteries. LFP batteries are cheaper, more stable, and longer lasting. They use far less nickel, relying instead on iron-based designs. LFP batteries are now used in nearly half of all EVs, according to the IEA. The Chinese EV market has already made the switch. It is now dominated by nickel-free LFP batteries. China built Indonesia's nickel industry to feed its own supply chains, and now China's own EV market no longer needs as much nickel. Putra Adiguna of the Energy Shift Institute captured the situation precisely. The forests have been exploited to the brim, but you never got the electric vehicle value chain. Indonesia's domestic EV market offers no rescue. The country sold just 43,000 electric vehicles in 2024, accounting for about 5% of total car sales. There are only around 2,500 charging stations nationwide. Even if Indonesia produced 1 million EVs per year with nickel-rich batteries, that would still consume less than 1% of its national nickel output. Chinese automaker BYD is still building an EV plant in Indonesia. CATL, the world's largest EV battery maker, broke ground in 2025 on an approximately $6 billion integrated battery project with Indonesian state firms, spanning the entire supply chain from mining to battery recycling. Indonesia now finds itself sandwiched between the United States and China, both of which want control of its critical mineral resources. Li Shu, director of the Asia Society Policy Institute's China Climate Hub, framed the dilemma directly. How does Indonesia straddle between the two superpowers who both want to gain control of the national resource that Indonesia has? Make no mistake, it's going to be very difficult. Other Southeast Asian countries similarly sandwiched between the US and China are watching Indonesia closely. This situation is a template for the entire region. Indonesia's nationalization drive could loosen Beijing's grip on parts of the supply chain, giving Jakarta more leverage to court US buyers and investors. One potential concession in long-running trade negotiations with the Trump administration would be to lift the ban on raw nickel exports to the US. Indonesia has already invited the US to invest in its critical minerals sector as part of ongoing tariff negotiations. In theory, US and Indonesian priorities are aligned. Indonesia wants to diversify away from China, and the US wants to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled supply chains. But Chinese firms are so deeply embedded in Indonesian nickel operations that it is nearly impossible to engage with Indonesian nickel without touching Chinese-affiliated operations. The core question for US policymakers is what diversification actually means. If it means production outside China geographically, then Indonesia's export ban actually helps US interests. If it means reduced Chinese corporate control, then the US would need to build entirely new supply chains, excluding Chinese firms, at enormous and sustained cost. The environmental and human rights dimensions of this story cannot be separated from the geopolitics. Mining drove the loss of approximately 370,000 hectares of Indonesian forests between 2001 and 2020, more than in any other country, according to an analysis by the World Resources Institute. More than a third of that loss was old-growth rainforest, which holds vast carbon stocks and is crucial for limiting climate change. According to Rainforest Foundation Norway, the EU's EV policy alone could lead to the loss of the equivalent of 18 football fields of forest per day for 25 years. Indonesia's nickel smelters run heavily on coal-fired power, and major nickel producers emitted approximately 15 million metric tons of greenhouse gases in 2023, according to the IEFA. The green energy transition is, in significant part, being powered by coal. NGOs including Mighty Earth, Climate Rights International, and Global Witness allege widespread abuses, illegal clearing of thousands of hectares of forests, failure to obtain free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC) from indigenous communities, severe pollution of drinking water, and intimidation, attacks, and killings of those who speak out. Norges Bank Investment Management, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, excluded French mining group Eramet from its portfolio after citing unacceptable risk that it had contributed to severe environmental damage and serious violation of the human rights of uncontacted indigenous people through its role in Indonesia's PT Weda Bay nickel joint venture. In November 2024, investors representing $4.5 trillion in assets signed a letter urging automakers and EV battery manufacturers to enhance their environmental and social due diligence in nickel supply chains, demanding mandatory FPIC protocols and third-party independent auditing. Investor signatories have since grown from 29 to 36 major institutions, including Legal and General Investment Management and Storebrand. So, what should the United States actually do? Analysts identify three realistic options. The most efficient path is direct engagement with Indonesia through offtake agreements, minority equity stakes, and joint ventures focused on precursor production or downstream conversion in the US-Chinese majority. Control of battery-grade production is expected to decline from roughly 80% today to 54% by the early 2030s, creating a genuine opening. The Indonesian government has demonstrated willingness to mandate divestment, which creates further opportunities for US firms, but this requires sustained government-to-government coordination to provide regulatory clarity, financing, and political cover. The second option, pivoting entirely to LFP batteries to avoid Indonesian nickel, trades one dependency for another. The LFP supply chain is 99% concentrated in China for cathode production, and Chinese firms KTL and BYD are the global leaders in LFP innovation. The third option, building entirely domestic supply chains, is enormously costly and time-consuming, requiring long-term industrial policy far beyond anything currently planned. China's approach in Indonesia illustrates the decisive importance of coordinated public-private investment, long-term capital commitment, and coherent industrial strategy. These are lessons the United States must absorb if it seeks meaningful supply chain diversification. The ongoing tariff negotiations between the US and Indonesia represent a concrete vehicle for a critical minerals agreement. Indonesia has already signaled willingness to lift the raw nickel export ban for the US as a potential concession. That window is open, but it will not remain open indefinitely. Nickel is not just about electric vehicles, it is in the stainless steel of hospital equipment and kitchen appliances. It is in the defense alloys of military hardware and naval vessels. It is in the batteries of the cars Americans are increasingly purchasing. If China controls the nickel supply chain, it controls pricing and availability of these products for American consumers and the US military. Indonesia's nickel situation is a microcosm of the global competition over strategic materials. China has already demonstrated willingness to weaponize mineral supply chains through recent rare earth export restrictions. The US is playing catch-up across multiple critical minerals simultaneously. Indonesia's dominance will only deepen, 75% of global mined nickel by 2040, according to IEA projections. Every year of inaction entrenches Chinese corporate control further. Indonesia controls 60% of global nickel, and that share is growing. China built that dominance through state-backed investment and technological innovation that Western companies could not match. Indonesia is now reasserting state control, creating uncertainty but also a narrow window of opportunity. The EV market is shifting away from nickel, undermining Indonesia's original industrial strategy, and the US remains largely on the sidelines without a coherent strategy for the most consequential mineral supply chain of the coming decades. Indonesia has what America needs. China has what Indonesia needed to build it, and now all three are trying to figure out what comes next. The green energy transition was supposed to reduce geopolitical dependencies. Instead, it has created new choke points, and China positioned itself at nearly every one of them.